Welcome. We have a interesting, slightly offbeat seminar today. It's my pleasure to welcome Denise DiPersio from the Data Consortium.
So you can just use that to control.
But if you didn't put up your hand, I don't know what you do.
What? Oh, no. Well, that will change today.
I don't know on DC, we have a problem. So we have a problem.
I don't think we have graduated a single PhD from our groups in the last 20 years, 25 years. So, yes, absolutely. So I'll tell you more about LDC another time, but today let me just tell you a little bit about our speaker. So one of the things LDC does is it takes away all the headaches of data that we need to do on it. But of course, that doesn't mean that it's easy. You just go to mechanical search, something shows up. And so Denise, who's the associate director of LDC, is very much involved in figuring out how to acquire data, how to use it properly, how to both be compliant with the laws, but also with the general spirit of what we do think. Because LDC is part of the University of Pennsylvania, and UPenn being a not-for-profit educational institution has its own institutional goals as well. And so Denise is sort of the blue person that works with technologists, works with the data creators and annotators, and tries to make the whole ecosystem work. And if you look at this resume carefully, she's not an engineer, she's not a computer scientist. Anything, she's a lawyer, and she's practiced law for a number of years. She did an undergraduate from Bryn Mawr, which is not very far from here, actually.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's a Bryn Mawr school in Baltimore.
There is.
The sister school of college. Yeah.
That's correct. I know that. Yeah.
And after that, she studied law in Miami and worked for many years as a lawyer before coming to LDC. And today she will tell us how to think about some of the issues that surround the proper use, proper collection, use, storage, disposal of data and various things. And the title is in front of you. Denise, please take it.
Thank you, Sanjeev. It's such a pleasure to be here today. So as Sanjeev alluded, there's been a close relationship between LDC and Johns Hopkins, from CLSP to HLT COE and others here. So many collaborations and long friendships. So it's very nice. It's very nice to be here today. I've met already some of you that I've talked to over time and hadn't met before, and re-meeting people. So it's been a pleasure, and I'm very, very happy to be here. So what we're doing today is we're going to take a look at these broad fields of machine learning, natural language processing, artificial intelligence, and try to see, try to think about what the impact of these technologies are in a broader scale. And what that means, I mean, let's face it, the technologies that are coming out of all of these fields are changing pretty much everything for everybody. And it's fair to say that not some people, it's a positive change, and for other people, it's a negative change. So what we want to think about today as agents of that change, and as people who are going to be driving future developments in this field, and kind of, charting what's going to be happening, what responsibility do people have in the field to assess the risks and benefits of what they're doing, and then to take appropriate steps during the development cycle to address that. And so that's what we're going to look at. And of course, ethics is all over the place today, most particularly with ChatGPT and generative technologies. You're seeing it everywhere. But this discussion has been going on for some time. And I know one of the criticisms is it's very easy for people to say, this is an ethical problem, and easy to point out the problem, but maybe not so easy to point out the solution, or maybe people who are being critical are not really trying to point out a solution. And that can be frustrating. And maybe you felt some of that frustration as researchers. So I'm here to say, first of all, there's no hard and fast answer to anything. So there you go. And you probably already know that too. But the purpose, what we're going to try to do in today's talk is we'll be raising lots of questions. And then out of those questions, start thinking about a framework within which you can start to deal with some of the various issues that you can be presented with during the research task. So that's where that's how it's going to go. So we'll get started. So I thought initially, before we get started, we should all take a minute and look at the Parthenon. I've been talking about Greece to people today because of ICAST, but why we're looking at it in this talk is because for any of you who in your journeys have taken a philosophy class or an ethics class, you know that a lot of the principles that surround ethics that we consider to have to do with ethics were articulated by the ancient Greek philosophers. So that would include Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. So this is just a moment for us to kind of, take a look at that before we now plunge into something that's a little more perhaps prosaic. So what is ethics? And let's just start with some very general common dictionary definitions. These first three are from the Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. A set of moral principles or values. Okay, well, let's drill down from that. So what's moral? Of or relating to principles of right or wrong in behavior. A principle, what is that? A rule or code of conduct. And values, moral principles and beliefs or accepted standards that apply to a person or a group or some larger community. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing here that there are principles that relate to right or wrong. So there's a concept of right or wrong that's governed in some way, perhaps by a rule or a code of conduct, and that these are embodied in values that actually are multiple types. So we understand that we have personal values or personal ethics. Those are part of us, and we acquire them in our daily lives and from different outside sources. There are other kinds of ethical issues or that come to us by virtue of our professions or our social group or our larger community. So, and this is an interesting thing. So when researchers confront a task, you're confronting this using all of these multiple things that you've been exposed to. It's your personal beliefs, even though they may not be front and center in that you've got a list and you say, I believe, X, Y, Z. It's influences from your community. It can be other influences as well. So you're bringing all of these to the research table. And this is kind of how, so we want to keep that sort of multifaceted idea of ethics in mind. And how are ethics expressed in everyday life? Many ways, through laws. We think about that through policies. Those can be established by the government. They can be by other kinds of means, like educational policies in general. People talk about norms, which can be things like principles that some group follows. And then there are professional standards, and doctors and lawyers are probably the most common. They are subject to very specific ethical standards of behavior. So if we were trying to think of a principle for today, just to keep in mind as we're moving forward, I would suggest something like language technology should serve all interests of society. And let's just leave it at that, and I'll try to go further than that, but just kind of keep that in your mind as we progress through our discussion today. So now that we've set up this thing, here's, kind of what the body of ethics is. What happens when we get to the machine learning example? It's complicated, as you can see. And I would think that even the ancient Greeks would have pause and have to think about how does this apply to something like machine learning? So what the premise we're going to start with, and which is really the case, is that ethics intersects with these fields all across the development cycle, starting from the research proposal down through deployment, that there are going to be issues that you're going to confront, and that you'll confront them in the beginning, and then you'll find yourself re-confronting them, maybe in different aspects or adding different ones as you move through the cycle. And how are these going to come about? And there's going to be intersections. There'll be legal issues, and the most common of those are intellectual property and also privacy law. There'll be regulatory issues, and I think many of you here are very familiar with human subjects collections and related restrictions from the IRB or outside the United States ethics review boards. Then there are just general notions of privacy, which also can come into play that may not be specifically regulated. Then there are sort of the dual, opposite ideas, fairness and bias, and that basically that those are things that you have to think about also all across the cycle. So these are the different things that are going to interplay into your research task. So we say it begins with the research proposal. We shape our tools and our tools shape us. Maybe some of you know who Marshall McLuhan is. Maybe not. He's a guy who in the 60s and 70s was very interested in mass communication and talked a lot about the effect of mass communication on society in general, and is actually considered sort of the founder of the communication studies field. He had a lot of pithy quotes. In fact, you can find on the web like pages of his quotes, and some of them are pretty dense. But one of his most famous ones is "The medium is the message." And that's one that, gets repeated down through time, and that's still very relevant. But I like this one. We shape our tools and our tools shape us. So that's kind of setting up a little bit of a conflict here, because we humans are who creates tools or who does research. It's a human. And then this starts to be something. The project starts to turn into something. And is there a time there's a tension? Where is that line? Does the project kind of sort of engulf the individual? And are there sort of ways in which they're interlocking with each other? And is there, maybe some of the general assumptions or perceptions that you had at the beginning of the process are now changing, but why are they changing? So these are things to keep in mind. And I think this is a way of also explaining what, people talk about the unintended consequences, or in the Grimmer example, the Frankenstein effect. But the idea is that something can happen down the road that you didn't expect. So keep that in mind as well. So running through the very beginning part, and these are just some of the things that you're going to consider at the beginning of a project: the research question and the methodology. And those, of course, are affected by a lot of different things, not just your, a particular research interest. We know that if you're being funded to do work, there are going to be funding expectations. And then and that the funder expectations are what's going to be the result. What does the funder want to see? And then you have to go from the initial question to that end and work out through the process. There may be other motivations that are making you do research: better performance. You want to get a better word error rate, and you want to beat somebody else's system. So there are other things that can come into play when you're developing the research question. Now, what are some of the strategies here? I think that there is this idea that researchers in these fields are designing for somebody, for some group, for some constituency. And one of the ways that to kind of turn that question a little bit and think a little bit more about the ethical part is, well, who are the people who are going to be affected? Who are the potential users, and what are the use cases? And try to spend some time, and maybe you already do at the beginning, to try to plot those out. What is it? What's going to happen at the end? And what are some of the ways that there could be effects that I don't understand? Or even if this is what I want, is this really the best thing overall? So it can be expressed in different ways, but one way that I've seen is to say design with people, not for people. So this may mean that you have to take some consultation in that beginning stage. And so that then plays into what's going to be collected and measured. So in the speech example, which I know all of you are working in here, you're working with a particular language. We certainly know that, there are tons of resources in English. English is the most studied language. And then there are resources in maybe a handful or more of other languages that don't approach still significant, but not approaching what's in English. And then there's the rest of the 7,000 other languages out there. So what are you going to collect? And what's going to be measured? So that's one piece. How will you mitigate any potential bias? So when you're deciding these collection questions, you want to think about data diversity. And that means a lot of different things, but in basic terms, that just kind of means where's the data coming from? And how static or how diverse or how spread out or different are the different sources that are in the data. You want to think about its availability, obviously, and maybe you need some domain expertise here to help you out, to show you maybe other places you can go to get a better sample of what you want to collect. Now, some people say with data that working from a prepared corpus, has issues that you have to recognize because that corpus is already prepared and it's already finished, and therefore it probably contains some biases in the way the data was collected and measured. Now, as someone who works for an organization that has like 900 of these, I obviously think that there are benefits. And I think that it's demonstrated that there are benefits to working with benchmark data sets and data sets that have been collected before. But that's also an issue to consider in your particular research question. That might not be the best solution. And some people say, just start with raw data because, that's clean. There's nothing going on in there and you can do what you want. But there are lots of people who've been writing about the fact raw data is an oxymoron. There is no such thing. So even raw data is collected according to some kind of logic, or there may be, whatever information that's available about that data has already been established. So be aware of that. Be aware of that as well, that raw data may already have some things that you need to look into to make sure that it's going to work for you the way you want it to work.
So how can I ask a question? How do you see ethical and those? Consider with one. You have a data, there may be some biases or something there. How do you see ethical question there? Like, do you see it as a feedback loop? Like, if you start something and you learn that there's something I would fix inside this, or just don't use it?
Well, no, I think that's a good question. I think that I think it can be both. There can be something that you can spot right away, but you might not be able to spot it right away. And that's why you come back to these questions in the process. And it can be through a feedback loop. That's one way. And that's one place to discover. And maybe then, you have to tune, you have to tweak, and you have to see, how you can mitigate that. Or you have to at least be able to explain it at the end when you explain how something works, because you want people to understand that if results are going to be misinterpreted, you have to, how they could be misinterpreted because there's something in the data that's going to drive this particular result. So I think that's one way to handle that issue. And that's why we say, that's why here in operation, the ways to look at this are in model development, in whatever metric is chosen, in the way you're designing the algorithm. And gets into very nicely the next point too about the black box, because transparency is the other big word, byword now that runs in connection with discussions about ethics. So everyone says, forget the black box. You guys know what's in the black box, but we don't know. No one else knows what's in the black box. So you have to think about strategies about how you're going to help users understand how the model works. And there's always back and forth, the idea of employing some of these different strategies may work out in trade-offs between accuracy and transparency. And that's just part of life. And that's something also that you're going to have to keep in mind as you move forward. We talked about availability. Can the data be used for its intended use? If it's going to be aggregated or linked, what are going to be the effects? And this is where re-identification comes into play. So we know that it's not very hard in many cases to re-identify data from only a couple of data points. And then maybe if you add biometric data into the mix, like speech, how does that come into play? So if you're going to be aggregating your data with other kinds of data, that's something to be thinking about. And again, these same issues are going to come up as we move forward. So again, let's talk about data collection more specifically, and let's talk first about human data collection from human beings. What I want to focus on here in terms of data diversity, I think, is really what we refer to as underrepresented groups and underrepresented languages, because I think this is where a lot of the focus is, and that's been confirmed in some of the discussions I've had with some of you this morning, that again, major languages have been studied and studied. We know there are lots of languages that haven't been studied. And so we want to understand, we want to now get resources for these languages because we think that's something that's good. We have to remember some of the things about underrepresented groups and languages that we should think about when we approach these kinds of collections. So first, it's the idea of respect for language communities, or even something broader like a speech community. So understanding that communities that have as part of their heritage an indigenous language include people who have to work in the real world as well. So they have learned maybe one or two other languages for going to school and for having a job. So there's a lot of things going on in there. And so sometimes the idea is you have to have a broader perspective on language. And I know there's work, lots of people are interested in code switching now, at least it seems to me from discussions that we have with researchers asking us about data. Who owns a language? That's actually not a question easily answered, but for some languages, the community believes that it owns its language and it has control over how its language should be used. So again, that's an issue that ties into respect. And the idea there is if you're collecting directly from the community, you want to be sure that everyone understands that there's consent, that they have access to what you're doing, and there may be other things that you would want to do as well. And then there's also like a power dynamic going on with underrepresented groups and languages. And I'm referring here to in great part to a paper by Stephen Bird, whom some of you may know, who's done a lot in the field over the last few decades. He has a good paper, Decolonizing Speech and Language Technology. He's been working for years with indigenous languages in Australia, the languages of Papua New Guinea, and also in the Brazilian rainforest. And, he's reflecting back, he's saying, hey, our community has to understand a few things about, what presumptions we have about these languages. So one is think about zero shot, zero resource. And that seems to be, again, something every time I go to a conference, there's more and more papers about that. And of course, when you work at a place that has data, you're like, okay, maybe that's good. And I'm not saying it isn't good, but think about the effect of that. When you're looking at a language that's part of a community that may have a special meaning with cultural heritage and identity, aren't you then, you're disenfranchising the local knowledge authorities. Then you're kind of saying, I can just I don't have to know anything. I can just swoop in with, whatever tools I have, and I'm just going to put this together. Another piece of that, the idea of goal data is the objective. So it has to be systematized and it has to be aligned and translated and annotated. Even using words like unwritten language, under-resourced language, or acutely under-resourced language is kind of privileging the Western ideas over non-Western groups. So again, thinking about that. And also then thinking that technology is the answer. Technology is the answer for these groups, and maybe not so much. Apps maybe don't save a language. Maybe people revitalize their language using technology. So it's just a way of, again, thinking a little more broadly about approaches. And of course, also human subjects we know involves the IRB, and I'm impressed that everyone I've talked to today knows how to handle the IRB. So that's great. All the things you have to say there. But what's also important at the end is really when you explain how your data is being stored and secured and archived and shared, because those factors are just as important to protecting an individual's privacy and any other commitments you're making in the collection.
Denise, maybe I should ask you a little bit more about, with issues like taking the attitude that somehow some technology is going to save a language really sounds patronizing, because the technology doesn't save it. People who do what needs to be done,
Right.
They might just use technology. But when it comes to describing situations where, for example, if a language does not have a long written tradition, and as a result, it's very hard to get consistent written forms of things and so on and so forth. I don't know how else to describe it if you don't call it a language without a standard writing system. Right. I'm not being pejorative. I'm simply saying there isn't one. And so how does one navigate?
Yeah, I think you make a valid point, and I think it's I think what, and if you look at Stephen's article, I think he's really trying to make a point and maybe overstating the point a little bit, just to kind of open it up, because it's certainly the case that you need to have an orthography to do a lot of these different things. And it may be something that the community will want as well. It's just in the approach to it, I think is probably what he's talking about more or less, that they're a way. I know in some of the work in Papua New Guinea, they organized like community transcription groups who took material that people had used cell phones to record. And so that gave the community a sense of, belonging to the process. So I think maybe that's I understand where you're coming from with that. And that may sound a bit extreme.
I can also understand, Stephen, your point that we are imposing Western standards or some sense that, when it comes to how do I translate the French sentence into English, we all accept that there are three different ways of translating which are all equivalent. And we say, what a bummer, it's hard to build this technology given that two different people will do two different things. But we don't accept that when it comes to, somebody said this, can you write down what he said? And three people write it down three different ways.
Yeah, that's right.
We just say, no, you guys are just we don't accept that as a natural state
Right.
of things. So we are imposing our standards.
Yes. No, that's right. That's
But it's still an issue, and I guess the issue to point out maybe to say we had some implicit assumptions when we were doing this for our languages where we have certain attributes and your language doesn't have it. So rather than call it a deficiency of the language, maybe we should think about it as a deficiency of our language.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yes.
Sorry, can I weigh in on this for a second? So hi, I'm
Hi.
Deborah Matthews.
Yeah, can you actually do a 30-second introduction? This is Professor Deborah Matthews. She's the Associate Director of Research at the Berlin Institute of Bioethics, which is part of Johns Hopkins, and she has studied ethics for a long time, and more recently she started engaging with people in AI and machine learning to help us take this one.
Huh.
Deborah.
And we've been
Nice.
friends for a long time.
Okay, great.
So pardon for butting in, but on
No.
this particular issue, I think it's important to note that there's a global movement for indigenous data sovereignty right now.
Yeah.
That is really gaining like steam and clout and starting to move policy in important ways. And so I think in situations where you're talking about any kind of indigenous language, there's special sensitivity now that I would hope then sort of spill over into other local groups and communities, but special sensitivity around nothing about us without us. Like you have to engage the community and first ask the question is like, are you even interested in like, because that's not your decision to make.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Is the technology something that should be built?
Yeah.
Which isn't a question we necessarily ask ourselves, but and even in the area of language documentation, which is a linguistic test that's been going on for a long time, which has a lot of the same built-in things. If you think of linguists and anthropologists going into the field, many set right to like now explain you to everybody else. There a lot of people believe the evidence shows that language documentation hasn't done a heck of a lot to save a language either. So, yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. All right. Well, now we'll move on to web data collection, and I've chosen web collection as the second topic to talk about here because I think my perception is that speech obviously is very key right now, and people are collecting speech, and it seems like the major source for the rest of the data we collect, and even for speech, is the web. So basically, this is what we deal with a lot, and it's what a great thing it is, right? It's just like out there, and it's got everything on it. So, traditionally, the major issue with web data collection, at least at LDC, in my perspective, has been intellectual property, and mainly in that case has been copyright. And we can say now that after several years and some legal cases like the Google Books case, for example, that in the United States, courts generally recognize that the machine learning use case fits pretty well into a fair use exception. So fair use is an exception to copyright law. I know you're still infringing somebody's copyright. I know a lot of people think fair use means you're not doing anything wrong. You're still infringing their copyright, but there's an exception because of what you're doing. And the idea in the machine learning or NLP use case is that what you're doing with the data is so transformative, it's not fit for its its original purpose. You're not harming the copyright owner by what you're doing. So that really has empowered the community. It's really, said, okay, I could just web scrape at will. And that's, that was a big plus when that happened, obviously, for many of the collections that we all have been doing over the last few years. But I would say there's the other side to web collection. There's always the terms of use, the thing that you have to scroll down to the bottom and click on that tells you can only use one copy for your own personal non-commercial use, that may restrict redistribution, but it may also talk about consent for third-party data that's on the site, about privacy issues. And I would say, and as that really these issues, and I would say around privacy, around biometric information and multimodal data, under the ethics banner, so to speak, are really now taking center stage. So while it may be acknowledged that on copyright law, you're okay, you may not be okay anymore by kind of blowing off the terms of use, which I think I would say everybody kind of did. Saying, well, they're there, but I have this other gateway to collect. And so I would just want to bring a couple of examples to you because I think we're seeing a bigger emphasis in this area. So you probably are familiar with the Clearview AI case, the company that basically scraped everything, YouTube, every site you can imagine for faces, and then sold that database to law enforcement. So that upset a few people, obviously, and there was a big lawsuit. There were actually several consolidated together. The ACLU was one of the plaintiffs in that case, and basically Clearview AI settled last year and said, okay, we won't distribute our faces database anymore to customers. We'll just distribute our algorithm. One thing that in terms of privacy, and I'll talk about this maybe a little bit more later, but the United States doesn't have like a big privacy law like we think of as GDPR in the European Union. So there's a bunch of little laws, and there may not be necessarily a little. I mean, one of them is HIPAA, but there are laws that govern different sectors. But more states now are enacting privacy laws. So you might have heard of the California privacy law, which has is very strict. And, so even when you're on a website and maybe making choices there, you may see a choice about California privacy law. Illinois has a biometric information protection law, and it's had it for quite some time. And basically, you're not supposed to use any biometric information about Illinois citizens without their express consent. So in the particular case of this lawsuit, because it involved Illinois citizens, Clearview AI had to agree to delete everybody from Illinois from their database, as well as anything they might have uploaded. I can't remember the exact way they figured out, who all the Illinois people were. So that was another benefit of a law like the Illinois law. There's the LinkedIn HiQ case, and this one really centers more on data scraping. So the idea is there was an early decision that seemed to indicate that LinkedIn, and we all have information on LinkedIn that we put up there, can LinkedIn really control other people and say that they can't come and take our information, which in the end is our information. So in this case, HiQ did that. They actually had an agreement with LinkedIn where LinkedIn sold them the information, and then they kind of ended their relationship, but HiQ went and scraped the website anyway to continue what it was doing. So that case hasn't been resolved yet, but many are saying based on that early decision, if that's carried through, that's a great win for web scraping any site where the site owner, where the organization controlling the site, like a LinkedIn, doesn't own the data. It's not theirs. Although when you post your data on sites like this, they obviously take lots of rights to your data to pretty much use it as they will. The Getty Images Stability AI case is one in the UK. Getty Images has been very aggressive in trying to, find out where people are taking Getty images and using them. So Stability AI scraped Getty and for its image detection system. So they're being sued in the UK over that. And then there's a more recent case where GitHub users are suing OpenAI and Microsoft, and you know that Microsoft owns GitHub. So it's all like the cabal, it's all together. And basically what they're saying is in this case, this was some tool that was a predecessor to ChatGPT, and I can't really explain it better than that. I'm not a technical person, but basically to develop this tool, OpenAI and Microsoft basically scraped GitHub. They scraped all the code from GitHub, but they took everything from GitHub, all the pieces of information that were there. So this is a class action suit where users are saying you violated, first of all, GitHub's terms of use. Secondly, you violated my privacy rights because you took everything from my GitHub site. And then thirdly, you violated any license restrictions that I might have had on my site about the use of my code. So that's an interesting one, and it'd be interesting to see how that works out. And then finally, in the data collection phase, I just wanted to mention quickly data management plans, which again, I know many of you are familiar with, working on NSF projects and now NIH projects. The whole idea out there in data is that it's really a global idea that data should be open. And I know many of you believe that, and I think that's right. And that's part of, what LDC was founded on, even though we know we have a paywall and whatnot, but there's still the idea that data should be as broadly accessible as possible. So there are now lots of ways people are trying to articulate that in different acronyms, but FAIR is one that's gained some traction internationally. You may have heard about it, that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. And we certainly at LDC, believe in that. And I think this is one that is the idea that informs a lot of what's behind data management plans. But even having said that, in a data management plan, you can still balance the idea of accessibility with constraints. So NSF has always understood that data that's collected in a project, while it can be made available, maybe there have to be some restrictions on the use or on the licensing of that data. So those are things you can still have an accessible data set, but you may need to take into consideration some constraints when that data is distributed. Okay, so now we come to milestones again. Here we are. Oh yeah, sure, Paula.
So who controls the line on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and how are these things? I don't know, how do they happen? I mean, because for us, it's just like very simple and perhaps very naive way of thinking that we can scrape the web, right? But we exactly don't know who is involved in making this decision of drawing the line of what is acceptable, what not, and how are these decisions?
Yeah, well, I think this gets back to the idea again that there isn't really any hard and fast rule about how to behave. You can take, and I think it's really every organization will have its own risk assessment, and that's what it comes down to. I mean, in many ways. And I think that, and certainly we do that analysis at LDC all the time. And because again, data we collect, even if who's ever funding us for the data doesn't wants it made available, but maybe doesn't really care about the details, we have to make sure that whatever we make available can be used, as Sanjeev alluded to, without worry to everybody else. So that may mean that we have to take some extra steps that even if our sponsor wouldn't consider a collection to be a human subjects collection, we may want to have an IRB because we think that's what we need to do to make this data set accessible. We may need to get a legal opinion, which we have done from independent counsel at the University of Pennsylvania, to make sure, that certain points are covered. We may have to go to a data provider and try to license it and maybe even pay them so that we can use their data if we have doubts about it. So that's how some of those questions can be resolved. And the other way, I think it is, you have to kind of have your own profile, and you're part of a larger institution with other people who are, available and resources. And this is another place where there may have to be some consultation depending on what's happening. It's not maybe the day when the researcher could just say, I can just do this. It's kind of past, and there has to be a broader conversation. Yes,
Yeah, so, you talked a lot about the side effects from like, the law.
right.
Where, and there's obviously a moral aspect of all of this that may or may not be different according to like other people. Can you talk about some examples where the law says that this is okay, but there are other nuances that may be brought up that can say that this is probably morally wrong, but the IRB and the laws are so far behind that they're not even thinking about it.
Well, and I think that's part of, if I can say, I think some of that's going to come out as we go through the talk. And that's really part of what we're saying. And the law is really just like here and everybody else is here. And that's part of the issue, especially in the United States, in terms of data protection and privacy. It's unfortunate that we're in that situation. So, but I'm happy to come back to this at the end, come back to me if you'd like to hear more, if I haven't covered some of these cases for you. Okay. Okay, so when we move into the milestones part, or what I would call milestones and what you guys would call analysis, or whatever you're doing during the development cycle, this is another place where it's a good place to check in and see where do things stand with those planning assumptions that you made in the beginning. And that's where you're going to think again about use cases, and you're going to think about things like bias and transparency. So have any assumptions changed at this point in the development cycle? And if they have, how? And there are a couple, maybe some different ways to test this. What if you change the model parameters? What effect does that have? Is it different? What about the workflows? Are they transparent and reproducible? And what about your expectations of results as against where model analysis is now? And then maybe remedial steps are necessary. So this could be a place where impact of false positives and false negatives might be relevant. So then we come to test, and then it's the same idea. Does the model behave as we expect it to behave? So this is where, again, maybe we come back to a check to like, what did we think about in the beginning? What was the way we described what we were going to do? And now we see what has happened. And then, is now the tendency to try to alter what we said in the beginning to match what happens later. And if that's good or bad, depending on what our assumptions are, we should recognize that. Are we backtracking from some ideas we had about bias and maybe some ethical concerns? Because now we see what the model does, and we kind of want to like tweak it to make sure that we match what happens. Or should it be the other way around? Should we be looking at saying, well, the model's not meeting what we did, so we need to like concentrate on that. And then this is also where you try to understand to what extent the model's output can be misinterpreted. And again, false positives and false negatives come into play here. Another way of saying, how well does the output reflect the data in the model? And then if it doesn't, then what about evaluating the model using a similar data set to see how it works there, and maybe try to understand if there are deviations if you're in, for a similar task. So finally, here we are at deployment. And this is where we really talk about transparency again, although you should have been thinking about it again from the beginning when you were, rejecting the black box idea. So here you're communicating stakeholders, you're communicating with users and everything about what you've done. Was the success metric met? What about sharing what you've done? How broadly are you sharing your data and your methods and your research? What kind of feedback are you getting at this point from stakeholders and others? And it may be that depending on your use case, you're going to have more transparency. So if whatever you're doing somehow disadvantages a certain group, a subgroup or a group of people, community, maybe more transparency will be needed. How about a highly regulated domain, like anything concerning money, like a credit decision, a loan? You're going to have to explain things more, I think. And there may be a need to have different kinds of use cases for different subgroups of users. So if you think about the banking example, an interface for the customer, for the lender, for a regulator. And then maybe if there's, depending on the result, and if the result could be one that harms someone, the idea is there should be some way to inform the user of methods of getting recourse or trying to go to someone else to help explain the decision to them. And this is where also real-time feedback mechanisms come into play. What are you seeing happening post-production with the way user experience is going? And I have heard people say there aren't bad algorithms, there are bad users. I mean, I think that can be partially true. And that just doesn't mean somebody who's trying to shortcut whatever the model is to do something bad. And certainly there are people out there who do that or try to, break through whatever security barriers are there. But it can just be that there are ways in which this thing is used that don't quite fit what was imagined in the research case. Still up there, okay. So I think that again, what's happening there? And then there's the idea of active learning. So we know that active learning is an important thing for technology. We know that's an accepted way of tweaking a system and understanding what its issues are. But again, I think there's a continuum. So there's on the one end, well, is it okay if your virtual assistant can't really explain that you have to take an umbrella because it's going to rain rather than, what's the weather kind of thing. On the other side, how about, an autonomous vehicle that still maybe isn't really recognizing red lights so well and runs a red light with potentially harmful consequences. So, what's tolerable in that continuum? So again, think about, what are the issues involved if there is with respect to active learning? Okay, so now we've kind of talked about what happens during all of these different stages, what you should be thinking about. So now we'll take a look at some examples of some applications that everyone, some real world examples of bias, I think, better way to put it. So here we go. And the inspiration here would be Weapons of Mass Destruction by Cathy O'Neil. Maybe some of you have read that book. I recommend it. It's a very easy read. And then a recent article by Suresh and Gutag about areas where there can be harm in the machine learning cycle, and I'll give a cite to that later. So for instance, models to evaluate teacher performance that were based basically on students' standardized test scores. The result was that bad teachers were retained and good teachers were fired. We know that in the law enforcement area, technology has failed pretty spectacularly. Some examples in the area of crime predictive software that's based on geography, which people said, well, there can't be any race bias in that because we're just doing a geographical, where does crime occur? And then we're deploying police to where does crime occur? Well, what happens is that's targeting minorities and criminalizing poverty. Recidivism, risk assessments, bail decisions, et cetera, that are based on things like arrest or encounters with police will result in false positives for African Americans. We probably all know a little bit about the US News University rankings, and that continues to be of interest. Those rankings are based on a lot of criteria, not just things like student to teacher ratios and courses and stuff like that, but SAT scores, acceptance rates, and alumni contributions, interestingly. So basically what happened was a lot of schools, once they figured that out, just started cheating so that they would move up in the rankings. And as a result, you may also know, it's been reported in the press, some schools have voluntarily left the rankings. Some colleges and universities have just said, this isn't who we are, and we're not going to, we refuse to be ranked like this. And I think most recently there have been several law schools that have publicly said they're leaving the rankings. Another case, automatic personality tests that were administered as part of the job application process were found to have the ability to discriminate against applicants with disabilities. And models using credit scores as a proxy for lots of different behaviors ended up equating bad credit with untrustworthiness and a lot more. And we know proxies are a valid way of developing models, and they have to be, right? Because you're never going to have every single piece of information that you need. But taking something like a credit score and putting it in as a factor for a bunch of different decisions that don't really have a direct bearing on credit scores, and credit scores can be caused by a lot of different things, ends up really not really being something that's a good thing. So can there be an ethical algorithm? And there's lots of people are weighing in on this issue. I think in the first place, it's kind of, it's a difficult definition task to say what is fairness when you're looking at the algorithm, who is harmed, what's the harm? I mean, those aren't easy questions to answer sometimes, they're easy questions to solve. So here are ways some people, differential privacy has emerged as a way that a lot of people think this problem can be solved. The definition I've used here is from the Harvard University Privacy Tools Project. Anything the algorithm might output on a database containing some individual's information is almost as likely to have come from a database without that individual's information. So recent examples, their 2020 census, the US government announced that the results were being handled using differential privacy. I have a reference here to a NIST challenge in 2018 involving public safety communications. Facebook has made data sets publicly available that were generated using differential privacy. What a lot of people agree on, I don't think it's too debatable, even for me being a non-technical person, is that differential privacy does create some trade-off with accuracy. And as researchers, I think your answer is going to be accuracy has to be a key over, I don't want to lose accuracy, but there may have to be some give here. So these are things that you have to think about and analyze and tweak and understand, where you might be, where the shifts may be. There's also a lot of talk about algorithm audits. And I think there's, a lot of talk about what does that mean? Does that mean that the code has to be disclosed? Some people think that's what it should mean, or is it an explanation? And that tends to be, I think the majority view is that you have to be able to explain how this thing works and what its effects are. So the GDPR doesn't have an overall requirement for transparency, but they do have certain cases where they require some explanation of how an algorithm works. And the language they use there is meaningful information about the logic. Well, I'm guessing, meaningful being the key word. What does that mean? But that's one way to look at it. It's another way, if you remove certain variables and rerun the code, is that a solution? And maybe that's a way to kind of figure out how the algorithm behaves. We also know then there are competing proprietary concerns. People consider algorithms to be a form of intellectual property or a trade secret. So all of those things have to be balanced. Okay, so now I'd like to shift and say, all right, what's happening in the real space here in terms of behavior that isn't really, I will say, reasonable. So here's where we come back to the Greeks, to a word called akrasia, which is a Greek word that has come to mean something like the inability to act as one thinks right. I've seen definitions of this that go from an extreme to procrastination to the other extreme of conscious misbehavior. But this is something that says, hey, save me from myself, maybe. But it really has been the case. I want to say it was during the Obama administration where a lot of the tech companies said, regulate us, help us do this. Okay, so I'm not picking on this particular individual here. It's just a nice visual. All right, so here are some examples from the last couple of years of cases of fines or lawsuits that have involved technology companies. Just want to make you aware of this. I mean, these things are publicized, but they're not always generally publicized. FTC refers to the Federal Trade Commission, which is a government agency that's really become the main consumer protection agency here in the US. So here we have a case of Twitter, who was under an order in 2011 because they had misused their users' non-public information. And so they were told that they couldn't, they were barred from doing that for at least 20 years. This order prohibited certain kinds of conduct. But then last year, They were fined because they were continuing to do it. So, and what did Twitter say when the FTC levied the fine? They said, well, this information may have been used accidentally for ad targeting. So, I think that speaks for itself. We see Zoom. What did they do? Shared user data without permission, misrepresented encryption services, and allowed hackers to disrupt meetings. TikTok, also unauthorized sharing of user information, improper use of biometric data, ad targeting. Meta, Facebook, improper handling of biometric information. That case was under the Illinois law. Tracking user activity after they logged off the platform. So we look at these amounts and we say, okay, these are large amounts to the normal person, but not necessarily to these companies. But I think the other thing to remember is that these companies have some of the smartest people in the world working for them. They all took philosophy courses somewhere along the way. Why is this happening? Why does it continue to happen in the 2020s when we go as far back as 2010 or before, where we knew we shouldn't be misusing people's user information, but yet it's continuing to be done? And that's where we see a lot of these tensions that I talked about earlier. So I just want to, so this is an example, and frankly, I think it's pretty shameful. And one of the reasons why regulation, I think, will have to happen. So here are some of the resources before I close, just that I was looking at today. And I can make the slides available for people. So this is the Suresh and Gutag article. I think you'll appreciate it because these guys are data scientists. So it'll be a little bit something more that's that I think you can relate to than maybe some of the things I've said. Here's the cite to Stephen Bird's article. I also want to call your attention to this website, the Data Science Ethos, created by the Academic Data Science Alliance, which is an organization that's devoted to improving education in data science, looking at different programs. Its members are universities with data science centers and institutes, et cetera. And they have a core on ethics. And they some of the framework questions that I posed today are based on the ethos that's published on this website. And what it does is it identifies all the different stages of the research cycle and then reiterates all the different questions that come to play. So I encourage you to browse through that when you can. Okay, so now coming to the end, to some parting thoughts. First, we know that bad behavior or unethical behavior is not new. It's not new to this field. It's been around for a while, and there have been times of disruption, times of technical change, societal change. So let's understand that to start. The second thing I want to say is that all of you are working for the good. No one is saying that anybody is sitting down with the exact idea of doing something that's going to blow something up, literally or not. That may be true for a very small number of people. We see that in different ways, and that's even expressed in some of the recent employee activism at tech companies. The Google example, when a lot of Google employees protested against the government contract that Google was doing, and where that was going to involve Google technology being used for defense purposes. But it is the case that tech tends to make those bad off worse. That just really seems to be the fact. And I think there are different reasons for that. There are societal reasons for that, just in terms of the way society works, people's access to resources. There's also access to technology. Not everyone has a personal computer. And I think it's true that not everyone has a phone. Some people are still paid in cash. Some people still have to go to a bank to deposit a check. So I think that we have to remember that when we're building technology that doesn't scale to every single user, because even it's not even that they can use that people can be disadvantaged by using technology, but being excluded from technology is also something that has that has a negative effect. And different surveys say different things, but there's one from Pew Research, and that's a pretty reputable charitable organization, that says overall people's trust in tech is declining. But another thing I'd like to say is let's look on ethical issues as a good constraint for design ideas. It doesn't have to drag innovation. It could be something that pushes us forward to imagine different ways of doing things and getting a similar result. And we've seen some examples of that. If you think differential privacy is a good thing, there are people working on ways to mitigate the pernicious effects of ad targeting. And then there's something else, just sitting down and engaging in a far-reaching thought experiment. What can I do? Let me just imagine building something, and then let's build it and let's see where the problems come up. I've heard this referred to as design fiction. Make up something and design it and then see where the problem areas are. And as I alluded to, I think regulation is coming. Law in general is slow to catch up with technology. And as I said earlier, in the case of NLP, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, it's dreadfully behind. But I think the other issue is that's going to mean some rethinking of traditional legal principles. And one of them is privacy. You may have heard things about people have expectations about privacy. There's a zone of privacy. These are concepts that have been developed in US decisions through the years. So I should have an expectation of privacy in my house. But what about the drone that could just like come up to my window? What happens to that? But even beyond those examples, because it's always been said, well, if you voluntarily give your information to somebody like a bank, then you understand it's not super private anymore. The bank may have certain restrictions that it has to follow with respect to your information. But it's so hard to now be specific because of all the kinds of information that's out there about everybody, that's being collected, that's being processed, that's being shared downstream. So I think there have to be some rethinking and work done there. Of course, the partisan differences in the US are really just unfortunate. Whichever side you think is the better one. There have been pending laws for data protection and privacy now for a couple of sessions. And I think only one of them has supporters from both parties. I think publicly the legislators understand that their constituents want these things, but getting them through will be a process for sure. But it seems that we really are past the point of what has been the traditional US approach, which is let industry do what it does. That's what we do here. We're not going to overregulate our researchers. We believe in progress. We believe in technology. But I think at this point it's pretty obvious that position isn't tenable. So having said all that, yes, we're in an interesting period. It feels like a lot of disruption. It feels like a lot of tension. But I would like to be optimistic. I think that first of all, we have a lot of good people working in this field. People are thinking about all of these issues. So at the end, I think it's going to be okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, and thanks for the great conference. I think the computer science is like data with branches, right? So that's why we have projects optimized. And then I think a lot of problems now, and just like there's no branches data that was very hard to crack, or they can first go to the community to understand what's really important and then crack the branches data. So then I want us to have some high level guidance here because like how do we think about problems that there's no branches data, it's hard to crack branches data, and or maybe there's it isn't a branch. Then how can the scientists or how AI researchers think about it? This kind of job, right? You say, oh, we have to ask humans to label data, but then humans can also have bias, and then the difference between knowledge from crowd versus the actual things about individuals like I'm interested. So yeah, it's a very general question.
Yeah.
That puzzled me a lot. Yeah, a lot.
That's an interesting question, and I think that speaks a lot to sort of design. I think knowing just from my experience at LDC, where we've collected and annotated, so much data, I know the pain that comes into creating guidelines. and assessing inter-annotator agreement and all of that, and trying to address bias, because even in particular languages, again, some of the under-resourced languages that we've worked with have political connotations. So asking people to annotate a particular language can be, you have to be sensitive to that and even to the content of the language. So there are a lot of different things that come into play. And I probably am not really qualified to answer all of your questions. I would just say that again, careful design and lots of consultation with your team members and others is really kind of the best approach. But yes, I feel for that. And that's, LDC is a little different in some respect because our mission is often to produce that ground truth. And so we're driven to that, but we understand that that's not easy for everybody else to do.
Let's try
Okay.
that. Give one more time then.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. I have a link for. Yeah. Yeah, well, or the, like,